Today I'm particularly delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel to talk about one of the crucial matters of our lifetime, I would say, not only because it affects our daily lives, but it also affects international relations. To share a few words on this phenomenon, artificial intelligence has picked up the pace in recent years. Not far from today, namely a decade ago, only developers were talking about its potential appliances, but today, increasingly, we are concerned about its implications, not only on social life, on economic life, on security field, but also on diplomacy. So to be more precise, with the rise of artificial intelligence, I think the changes that are about to come are going to be faster, but also wider in scope than I think ever witnessed before. So therefore, Vocal Europe, we consider this quite important, and therefore we are committed to produce more work in this field, and one of the latest research contribution to this field was conducted by one of my colleagues, Matthias Peschke, who has written a critical analysis, a policy paper, policy paper on this issue, and where he shares where exactly the EU stands with respect to this technology, and I invite you all to read it. So before we kick off, I'm gonna ask you to turn your cell phones off, because the panel is being recorded. And also let me briefly mention about the format of the event and the panel. I'll begin with a general question, and then there will be some specific and follow-up questions. And then finally we will open the floor for Q&A session. For the general question, I think each speaker will have 5 minutes. For each specific and follow-up questions, each participant speaker will have 3 minutes. That being said, again, I would like to really underline that we are thrilled to have this distinguished panel who come from different backgrounds and who will share with us more insights about the implications of IA on EU diplomacy. So first, seated next to me, we are delighted to have Andrew Camilleri. I hope my pronunciation is good. Andrew is a technical attaché at the permanent representation of Malta to the EU, and he has substantial experience in regarding the legislation in the field of technology. Next, it's a great pleasure to have Ricardo Castanheira, who has an impressive background in politics, law, private sector, and currently he works as a diplomat for Portugal on issues related to digital single market. Third, pleased to have Eline Chivot. I hope my pronunciation is also right, correct. A senior advisor from Center for Data Innovation. Her work is focused on technology sector and how European policymakers can improve, indeed, legislation to better promote digital innovation. Finally, very pleased to have Maaike Verbruggen, who is a researcher, who is a researcher at the Free University of Brussels. Her expertise covers the impact of artificial intelligence on military sector. All right, let me start with the general remarks and a question. I think one can argue that the significant developments regarding the artificial intelligence have led to many debates over the past decade in Europe regarding its potential implications in economic sector, in social sector, in security fields. However, I think little sustained attention has been paid to this this technology, which brings a lot of implication on on EU diplomacy. So, in that respect, my question to all panel is: how artificial intelligence is impacting and will further impact the work of diplomats, but also the work of policymakers in the coming years? Andrew, the floor is yours, maybe. You have 5 minutes.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel, and good afternoon to everyone. In terms of the impact that AI has on the work of diplomats, I think it's a bit of a open-ended question, so to speak, because I think the work of a diplomat, if you think about it in diplomacy, has not changed in a way. Our job is still to represent our countries, and to do that, to do it to the best of our abilities. We have to collect information, analyze it, and then put forward our input. Now, that has not changed, and it will not change with the advent of AI. What will change, however, is what kind of information we have, how do we process it, and how do we action it. So that's something I think is quite important to understand, that the fundamentals of the job will not change. What will change will be the way that we actually do our job. In this regard, I think one of the main benefits that we will see with artificial intelligence in terms of our work will be inefficiency. We will have the capability to be more efficient should we be able to use AI in a coherent way. And what I mean by that is that we have all this data which is around us, all this information, which right now is very difficult to access. But once we'll be able to access the information and have an AI which can help us to analyze the information and present it to us in a way that we can move forward, that will make our life that much easier in terms of seeing a broader picture and also being able to come up with a coherent answer. Just speaking from my personal experience, and I'm sure it's the experience of a lot of people who also work in this area, sometimes you find that you are in a meeting, you're discussing a topic, you have your counterpart sitting next to you, and you hear XYZ coming out of the meeting, and you get the information. You're analyzing the information, you're trying to make up a decision with your superiors on what should be the next steps coming forward. And then after a while you realize that, for example, in another working group which deals with a completely different topic, but which touches also upon the same things tangentially, they're talking about the same thing, but there's the same country saying ABC, or the commission is saying ABC. So there you see this discrepancy, which unless you know about it in time and you can action it, it's very difficult for you to do your job properly. So if you have an AI which can collect all the information, which you can give it, and then you can push forward with it, then I think that makes your job much more easy. The second point I think which is quite important in this regard is we have to make this distinction, particularly at EU level, between AI as a policy tool. So in that regard, what I was talking about right now in terms of like how we actually function in our day-to-day. So in terms of strategy, in terms of what we get in return, etc. And AI as policy. I think for a lot of time, especially right now in this current climate where AI is one of the buzzwords is going around, AI and this, AI and that, AI and that, we don't realize that the two things are quite separate in a way. So we have to be quite careful in realizing this aspect. What is important, however, is that if you want AI to succeed as a tool for diplomats and for governments in general, I think we need to also understand that it's not just us that have to be trained how to use AI. It has to be the whole spectrum of government, the spectrum of citizens too, which is trained to use it. If not, we will be missing out in this regard. So, for example, I'll give you an example from my own country. We just launched last week our AI strategy as a country. So one of the main pillars of this strategy is basically that of putting forward more and more training for our staff, for our diplomats, for our civil service, but also for the industry as well, and also for the people at large on how to use AI. I think we need to, in this regard, we need to have a more coherent approach, and that is the way that we can ensure that AI is actually used for in the best way possible.
Castanheira.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to Vocal Europe for inviting me to be here and sharing this issue with you all. I would say, and I would like to start saying that I absolutely agree with what Andrew just said. I think that basically the two main aspects that we find when we think about AI and diplomacy. AI as a tool, AI as a policy, and I would add a third aspect to which would be AI in the context of diplomacy. It means not just the matter of diplomacy itself, but also the context where diplomacy is moving on. And I think that we will discuss it in a more detailed way afterwards in the specific questions. But anyway, AI is nowadays we have no doubt about that anymore, a factor that impacts the context in which diplomacy and politics are practiced in a region, in a country, and we know already, just taking a look to the figures, that those countries that will be able to leverage the impact of AI on business, on the economy, will for sure have a significant head start. It means this is one immediate outcome that we have, but also geostrategic implications. It means that nowadays there is a shift when we think about the balance of power between countries and between regions, using AI. For example, when we think about the new arms race, USA, China in particular, the dominance in the area of AI related to the lethal autonomous weapons, it's something that is of course very, very relevant, and it's impacting on the context where diplomacy is nowadays moving on. But there is also another thing that would be the risky context. But there is also an opportunity, a big opportunity, I would say, thinking about cooperation, international cooperation within Europe and also at an international level. For example, when we think about international scientific cooperation in the field of AI, it can also be a very important factor to set up a common ground, especially if we think about, for example, AI for good. When we think, and we've been discussing during the last weeks about the climate changes, not just about the climate changes, but when we think about the United Nations sustainable development goals, this is something where nowadays AI is already put in place, and this is the kind of avenue that for sure a scientific cooperation based on AI can really improve the relationship between countries and between regions. I would say that I'm just trying to underline those 2 or 3 ideas on top of what Andrew already said, because it's clear in Portugal it's exactly the same. It means that we are now more and more trying to use technology. I would not yet say AI, because we hope to, but technology on the diplomacy activities, on our day-by-day activities, because of course it's about gathering data, it's about a lot of tons of texts, and this is something that can be done by in an automated way, because of course the analysis and the critical approach, it must be human. But gathering data, why we take so many time doing that? This is, of course, the perspective that already Andrew mentioned on AI as a tool. Remembering that AI is, from my perspective, personal perspective, it is not an end in itself. It means it's really instrumental, and this is very important to have in mind. Well, to not repeat exactly what Andrew already said, just I would finish my first round here. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Eline, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. My contribution will add to the contribution of Andrew and Ricardo. I would start by saying that we are in this new context where you have a lot more information flowing around, and that's disrupting foreign policy and diplomacy in several ways, particularly because you have new actors and new issues that are emerging and occupying the agenda. Thinking, for instance, of cybersecurity, election meddling, and of course, a lot of large technology companies that are carrying that information flowing around. And a lot of governments depend on them for the security of their critical infrastructure. And we depend on them for attribution as well when you have events of attacks. So that's something that is really important to keep in mind as a general context. Another element I'd like to add is diplomacy might not have changed, but this disruption through digitalization is challenging a little bit the traditional ways in which it works, in the sense that diplomacy and foreign policy is not exactly about moving fast and breaking things. and it's not open data is not a natural progression of diplomacy and foreign policy. The secrecy and control is very important to maintain, and when you have no control over who's the messenger, who's sending the message, who's receiving it, and I'm thinking, for instance, of social media like Twitter, where it's a little bit more unclear and a little bit faster, then I guess at that point you could wonder whether foreign policy and diplomacy is actually a fit for the digital world. But actually, I'd like to see there are synergies between technology and diplomacy. If you think of the way in which decision-making process works for diplomats, it's very much a rational process. It's about cancelling the noise of emotions and passion. For example, during the 30th War, Cardinal de Richelieu was a minister of Louis XIII, and he made the decision that the best alliance was between Catholic France and Protestant Sweden, which doesn't make sense against Catholic Austria, but actually from the state point of view, it made absolute sense. So it's also, diplomacy works with a very codified protocol to avoid any miscalculation or any overreaction. And also think of the ways in which the language of diplomacy has been protected over time, with mechanical cipher, seals of authentication, Morse code, and now with encryption. Another element that's important for diplomacy and foreign policy to keep in mind is that there is definitely a need to catch up and keep up. There's an AI global race happening, and it is also very much about foreign policy. For example, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has developed its own platform using deep neural networks to vet foreign direct investments, and they're saying that they really can see encouraging results. So another example is also, I've recently read that in the parliament, they're using WhatsApp, and they've just forbidden the use of Signal, and something I didn't know. But so even though social media platforms are widely used in the diplomatic and policy-making circles, if you think of other changes that are already happening, if you think of the whisper in the ear of a leader or a policymaker, it's no longer whisper in the ear, it's now the leader turning to its smartphone for real-time recommendations or scenarios or warnings against any mistakes. When you think of negotiations, it involves very much a calculation of outcomes, an assessment of strengths and weaknesses, which is something computers are really, really good at. Computers are also very good at processing a whole lot of information, and as there is a lot more information than before, you're going to need more AI platforms, more computing power to deal with all that. Think as well of how a computer is now able to beat human beings at AlphaGo. Diplomats are very good masterminds, but computers are also good strategists. I'd like to also add a few more elements of how it works in practice, how AI technologies, let's say, are changing the work of diplomats. So there indeed an opportunity for diplomats to work better, more efficiently, and to make better informed decision making. I've read about those micro negotiators, basically bots that run multiple rounds of negotiations and come up with a set of mutually agreeable options, which then diplomats can discuss in person. You also have some tools that are able to, for instance, the cognitive trade advisor of IBM that's able to go through a lot of information. For instance, think of trade agreements that are very data heavy in order to distinguish main topics and main patterns. Think about how we can use technologies for speech writing already, for instant translation. Also think about disinformation. That's also very important in the world of policy making, in the world of foreign policy. You can use technologies as verification tools. So there are many, many more examples actually that I could mention here. But in the end, foreign policy and diplomacy will, I believe, remain very much partly something that will happen behind closed doors, with a round table, flags on the background, and people with suits. There will still be a traditional way to do foreign policy and diplomacy, but there needs to be a whole lot more engagement, not just government to government, but government to people, people to people, and people to government. And AI tools are those technologies that can really enable that. And some recommendations that I see in my work that are often discussed is
oh sorry,
yes, I'm almost done. is to partner up with technology and industry. They have the technical expertise to support policymakers in making that digital transition. You need to streamline AI, not just have one unit or one department that use AI and understand what it is. You need to train the current generation of diplomats to understand how technology impacts their work. Think about deep fakes. You need to develop tech delegations and tech ambassadors like they did in Denmark and in the United States. There needs to be more data sharing between countries and more exchange of information and knowledge. Again, many, many more recommendations I could make, but this is where I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Maaike, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks so much. A lot of what I wanted to say has already been covered, but I'll try to fill in some of the gaps. I think it's really important to distinguish between the use of AI and the policy on AI. So a lot of the stuff, like Eline mentioned, about translations, summaries, or even very mundane things like helping with email or scheduling meetings, there AI plays an important role. But for the core tasks of diplomats and policymakers, those are not the first jobs that are likely to be automated out. I mean, developing connections, developing compromise, but coming up with new ideas, human remains essential, or no AI will dig up dirt on your opponents like a human can. But speaking about policy on AI, I think it's really important to keep in mind that AI is a super amorphous, broad concept. It's a cluster of related techniques or technologies that have no real clear boundaries. It's not a specific system or specific function, but it's a general purpose technology, like steam or electricity. So you shouldn't have blanket policies about AI. You need to think about specific tailored opportunities or problems that AI poses, and try to think of policy for these specific uses. That said, there are three general things I could say about it. Coming up with examples from my own security field, but it's not exclusive to security. I think for starters, it's important to develop innovation-proof regulation, because a lot of technology goes so fast, but faster than the regulatory bodies can keep up. So if you look at export controls, for instance, a very long list of describing to a very detail what type of technology falls under this or not, which means that it can take years and years and years for the list to be updated when technology advances. In contrast, the Chemical Weapon Convention has also, scheduled lists with which technologies are subject to verification, but they also say a chemical weapon is any toxic chemical that does harm on the battlefield. This is catch-all views about what falls under it or not. So if technology develops, then the regulations are still useful. So that type of regulation we need to think about. How can we develop this type of regulation? Second, there's the question of technical expertise. When you look at the nuclear field, there's tons and tons of physicists that work on the question of nuclear security and safety, work on the intersection of policy and physics. But here within the AI field, a lot of these discussions are really held separate, so we need a lot more programmers and part of the staff of politicians and the missions. We want these technical experts part of the policy world. There's this great scheme I saw I met some people who worked in the DC. They're like academics who work at STEM, and they take 1 or 2 years off to work in the office of a congressman, to support them in their S&T policy. I think that type of initiatives would be great as well. And the third statement I would like to make is that we should really be careful to not get swept away by, great expectations about AI. There's a lot of stuff that AI can do, but there's also a lot of stuff that AI still cannot do. And there's been a lot of historical disappointment about what AI can do, leading to previous AI winters. So when you make policy, you gotta keep it realistic, find your own information, don't get swept away by the hype, but try to really base your policy on on empirical reality, so to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. To exploit the power of moderator, I would like to conduct a speedy round of questions and answer. And I would like to turn the floor to Andrew. So can we talk about a little bit the opportunities that this new technology is going to bring to the area of diplomacy? For instance, our research done by Matthias has shown that artificial intelligence can play a significant role in negotiation process, and it can really analyze almost all the strategies of the opponent. So could you talk about your take on where EU stands with respect to these developments?
In terms of the EU as such, I think where this would, I think my first reaction where this would have the most immediate benefit would be when negotiating trade agreements with third countries. So there, imagine if we're a block of 27, all of us have our embassies, get all the information, together the commission is pulled together, and the AI can give us simulations on what these trade analysis could look like. I think that could be one of the main advantages, speaking more of the macro level. However, for that to happen, we need to have, as Ricardo was saying right before, coordination between all member states willing to share this information, which from my experience is not always that easy to do. It's quite difficult sometimes to share information between different departments in a government, let alone between different governments. So that's one thing where I think there are problems. I agree with you that these things could make the process much more efficient. Even the normal legislative process, for example, we could see laws being made faster. For example, AI is used for helping out the Commission when it's doing legislative proposals with its impact assessment. That would be something which could speed up the work, and we don't spend 1 year looking at, for example, at something that could be done in months. So that's something that I think could work. You could see, for example, an example of it could be used, for example, also in negotiations with Parliament or Parliament Council and vice versa. These are the kind of practical examples where I think it could be used. However, at this point in time, I don't think, if there's someone from the Commission over here, they can enlighten us. I don't think that there is any plan to use this kind of AI in this particular form. Having said that, I think what we have done in the past legislature, mainly the opening up of the PSI directive and the free flow of data, I think it's a good basis for the upcoming Commission to open up in this regard. So I think we stand at a place where we have to go fast, but we can start quite immediately. We don't have to wait a long time to move forward.
Thanks. I have another follow-up question. Do you think that the EU can be at the forefront of this development? And I think more interestingly, what are the risks of not advancing these technologies in Europe? What's your take on that?
Well, I think the risk is that of being left behind and becoming less and less influential, and that is something that we don't want, so to speak. Now, the current geopolitical situation is one where I think we need to be a bit more specific about and strategic about where we want to go also with AI. Just saying let's put AI in everything is not going to cut it. So we have to be a little bit more. I compare it a lot to the issue with privacy. The EU decided that we were going to go for the GDPR, and we set the standard, even though we were maybe a bit laggard in other areas with other parts of the world. So I think that kind of approach could be good in this regard, and I think the ethical guidelines that were recently published by the Commission are a step towards the direction. I look forward to see what's coming up by the Commission next 100 days, so to speak, and in terms of legislation. But I think the way forward is to start by having a bit more of a strategic reflection of where we want to go and move forward from there.
Thank you. Ricardo, if I may, let's focus more specifically on the potential interaction of artificial intelligence and the European foreign policy. As an expert who is experienced in both public and private sector, particularly on technological developments, would you argue that IA can really help the European Union to develop a more confident and cohesive foreign policy?
Well, your question is about the cohesive foreign policy. I think that to have a cohesive policy, if it is foreign or other, it depends to have a cohesive internal strategy, European strategy regarding AI, which is now, I would say, ongoing. We know probably Madame Verstager right now in the Parliament, probably she's giving some good news about it, because well, there is at least a commitment to present something during the first 100 days on AI. But we have a strong starting point, which is exactly the ethical guidelines. The ethical guidelines, it's a very, very important common approach. What it will be translated in afterwards in a legislative proposal or not, this is one of the big questions, because so far it's just about guidelines. At the same time, we have the several member states developing their own national strategies. It means that there is a high risk of fragmentation, and if we are not able to set up exactly this common ground, we won't have that cohesive AI approach, European AI approach, which will for sure impact in not just the foreign policy approach, but other strategies, but also the way that Europe, from an economic perspective, for example, or trade perspective, is behaving. That's why I think that right now, taking a look for what we've done it's important to note that AI has become a very important topic on the European agenda just 2 years ago. It means less than 2 years ago. It means that we are not, normally we take a lot of time in Brussels discussing the issues, but AI started in 2017, and during 2018 especially, it really became a very, very important matter.
You have 1 minute, sorry.
Sorry?
You have just 1 minute.
No, yes, I will start. What I think is that Europe has been able to do an amazing diplomacy and get an amazing diplomacy milestone with the GDPR, for example. It has become a global standard. What I think is that we should, or at least we should be willing to do exactly the same with AI from an ethical perspective. It means try to put it at least as a standard, and this is something that will afterwards impact on the way that the policy, the foreign policy, European foreign policy is conducted, you know. But having that ambition, because we did it with the GDPR, I think that is something that is very, very positive.
Sure, I have one more follow-up question for you.
Yeah.
The cooperation on artificial intelligence among the states, I think is quite crucial if you want to ensure its safe appliance. But since IA is such a strategic asset, do you think that the further development of this technology will lead to tougher competition among the states, as we have seen recently with respect to Huawei and 5G network?
It's a very good example, which is not yet closed, as you know. I think that it's a political issue. It's not even a technological discussion. It's much more a political discussion. It's something we are in between two blocks, because it didn't start in Europe, as we all know. But what I really believe is that Europe must build a framework for digital trust. An European framework for digital trust. It is for sure the base of any kind of digital strategy for Europe, which will, of course, impact on our AI strategy and our AI ethical framework, or whatever we will call it. And looking in the other side to the other side of the moon, it's probably from a competition perspective. We must also take it into consideration, because if we have the United States and China not developing, if they both don't develop any kind of ethical or trust framework on AI, if we are just we the Europeans doing that, for sure it will impact on our SMEs. It will impact the way that the European companies are able to get in the market, the way they compete globally, right? And this is something that for sure, and it's important to have Madame Vestager managing both areas, I would say, because she has a strong competition background, and also nowadays we expect for her to have the digital policy responsibilities. That's why I think that, because of course being a very important ethical island, globally speaking, can burden some of the expectations, especially from an economic perspective to our companies. Of course, this is the risk, but we should speak about it.
Sure. Thank you. Eline, I would like to turn the floor to you now. You have been advocating for an adjustment of the strict data protection in the laws in the EU. And is this because there's restrictive rules on data collection is an obstacle for advancing IA, when particularly considering the fact that big data is what makes artificial intelligence smarter? What's your take on that?
So there's a couple of reasons. One that I can briefly mention is indeed, as you mentioned, Ricardo, the fragmentation of our rules and systems across Europe. So that lack of a harmonization and to have a truly digital single market that isn't there yet is standing in the way of the development of businesses that are important to have to compete in a digital economy. When you the most competitive businesses in the digital economy are those that can harness network effects. That means that they need scale. And a lot of the value created by companies is made with scale. So we need that. That's one point. We need to finish the digital single market. But the other reason, that we're often discussing in my work at the moment is the implementation of the GDPR, the EU's privacy law, because of some of the requirements that stand in the way of the development of AI systems. Indeed, AI, in order to improve, needs data. It feeds on data. And another thing that's important to mention is that it is often described as a black box. That means that developers can put them to work, but very often they cannot explain how an AI has come up with a particular set of actions or recommendations. But the requirements of the GDPR, especially if you look at Article 5 or Article 22, are imposing a limitation in terms of the data that you can collect. It is also requiring for companies to explain and to be transparent about algorithms, which, as I mentioned, is a tall order when it comes to AI. Also, the threshold to obtain consent and to maintain it amongst users for companies is harder to get because of the fact that you need to provide them with clear information in plain terms. And again, that is very difficult when we're talking about AI. Another thing that I'm seeing in my work is when you talk to businesses, when you talk to industry, they are not necessarily all happy with the way in which it's going with implementing the GDPR. For example, Bitkom, a German trade association, is doing this survey annually amongst its members. And this year, 74% of them said that data protection requirements are standing in the way of the development of new technologies, whereas they were 63% in 2018 and 45% in 2017. So that says a little something about the way they're experiencing it. Also, the decrease of investment to young tech startups is another trend that we're noticing. And the lack of implementation across member states. Again, 3 member states haven't translated it in their national legislation. So, again, a few facts that are good to keep in mind when we're talking about the GDPR being a blueprint or a golden standard.
Well, I have a follow-up question referring to what you just said. Do you think that the EU is in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis United States and China, where data protection laws are less restrictive?
Right, so just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should have a system like China's system just because that it's easier, supposedly, to develop AI systems there. Doesn't mean we should copy them. We've published a report on the global AI race recently that's comparing the performance of the US, China, and the EU based on a number of research papers on AI, number of researchers, number of patents published, and also the investment, hardware. All these indicators suggest that the EU is lagging behind, China is catching up, and the US is still in the lead. So I think it is important for Europe to really focus on some things that matter for AI. Data, talent, infrastructure, integrating research networks like digital innovation hubs to avoid that any innovation happening in a lab doesn't find its market later as an application. And Europe is being active on this. These European AI strategies are actually hopefully a way to look at all our assets separately, to put that in common and further integrate it. There's also a lot of investment that the EU is putting on the table for AI research. But the discussion that we're having, to really answer your question on ethical AI, I think in order to have European AI and to be the referee and decide the rules and indeed protect our values and make sure that AI is at our image, the main thing is really to be able to have that technology on our territory. You cannot be the referee of a game if you don't know how to really play the rule and actually play them. So this would be to answer your question.
Very interesting, thank you. Now let's move to our next speaker, Maaike. In fact, we have already seen that drones enable states to engage in wars without worrying about the safety of their security personnel. However, we know that artificial intelligence will also strengthen defense capabilities. Does this mean that we are on the verge of a new arms race? What is your take?
I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with the term arms race. I think it's a kind of dangerous and potentially self-fulfilling prophecy. If you speak about an arms race, you really risk that countries are so embedded with the notion of this adversariety that there's a race to the bottom in the type of AI that they feel that they deploy without extensive testing, that it might not be safe, especially because a lot of AI, we still don't know a lot about how different AI systems will interact, how adversarial AI systems will interact. It's not like adding another nuclear weapon. So there are a lot of risks in this rhetoric. I mean, also AI is a general purpose technology. So it adds to a country's general military or technological capabilities, but it's not necessarily a weapon, not necessarily a hostile use against another country. AI is also not a zero-sum development. I mean, development in one country adds to development in another country. There's a huge global research community, there's a huge open source culture. If you focus on this arms race narrative, you risk a lot of data protectionism, that countries don't want to share data because they must advance themselves. But it's not, it doesn't have to be like that. And also, I think the rhetoric of arms race is often used for it's a political tool here. Especially in the US government, I mean, speaking of arms race is another tool in their trade war, is a tool to harm the Chinese tech sector, and also gain control over their own tech sector that doesn't always do what they want. And it's used, to call for funding, I see that a lot in US military discussions, slap Chinese arms race on it, and that improves your chances for funding. So,
One last minute.
Yeah. I think so. Europe should definitely, be active in AI, enhance AI, develop a strategy, but not just blindly follow the US and China. You need to think. So, what is in European interest? What do we need? What do we not need? I mean, US strategic interests are not the same as European strategic interests. So, what type of applications is good for us? What are we good at? Can we use these talents that we have? And don't develop AI just for the sake of developing AI so we can compete, so we feel strong.
Then my follow-up question would be that, how do you think that the EU should position itself? I mean, is there a way for the EU to play a productive role, for instance, by promoting something like a non-proliferation treaty similar to the one that we have for nuclear weapons?
No, it's a very interesting suggestion, something like the NPT. I think the risk of that is that it creates a clear distinction between the haves and the have-nots, like in nuclear weapons, and that will risk that all countries massively want to develop AI as quickly as they can to be part of these haves, and then we fall in these arms race dynamics we want to avoid. I think it's better to think, for instance, at the Chemical Weapons Convention, and think about such a broad range of uses that we have with these chemical compounds with AI, but we want to limit the worst ones. What the Europe here can do, I think, for one, is you mentioned the cohesion here. I think that's critical if the Europe wants to take action, because the European countries they're all over the place, and a lot of countries are actually still figuring out what they really want and what their position is. So develop a cohesive policy. And number two, diplomatic engagement. It's not really professional anymore to call for diplomatic relations with Russia and China, but this is really what's critical here. We need diplomatic discussions to develop some sort of standards, laws, ethics about autonomous weapon systems. See what role do we want humans to have when selecting and engaging targets. Like, what is the limit? What's for us to be acceptable? Need to think about how does certain use of AI risk conflict escalation between countries, for instance in early warning systems or in missile defense. There are some real risks here, and of course the risk in AI safety. There are huge problems. I mean, weapons are super complex, difficult systems, so if something goes wrong there's a lot more research we need here. We need some international agreement on this, and of course the EU should lead by example on this. AI is a big priority in the Commission, so everything that we do develop should be in line with laws, with our ethical standards. We need to think about what are the security or society implications of what we develop. This needs to be done openly with a lot of engagement with civil society, which not all aspects of the Commission are that good at, looking at the defense field here. Yeah. And actually, to counter Eline's point here, I think it's very interesting if you say, yes, we need to have the technology to be able to become a standard bearer. But for instance, think about the moratorium on facial recognition. The whole point is that we don't want this stuff to be developed, and there's a lot of danger. So if you first develop it, and then say, well, this is how we want it, you risk that the cat's already out of the box. So if Europe leads on the moratorium on facial recognition technology, it also sets a big mark on global standards.
Thank you so much. You have a point to make?
Just if you allow me.
Okay, before I
It's
open the
really
floor for
30
Q&A,
seconds.
yes, please.
Yeah, because Eline, she mentioned Bitcom study report, survey, which is true. We know that we are lagging far behind development AI. But it's not because of our values, when we think that we are lagging far behind because we are not retaining talent, because we are not putting the money that we need, the public and private sector, on that, we are not developing the Digital Europe program, which is really focused on that one. Because the states, they have 50% of the whole private equity into AI, globally speaking, and the Chinese, they are coming to. But this is not about the values. It means that's, when we speak about digital sovereignty, it's about values, and that's why we really believe that it's so important, and it can be a game changer if we develop exactly that so-called European framework for digital trusts, let's call it like this, to get that digital sovereignty, which I believe will conduct us as European economy, European project, in order to be much more competitive, Otherwise, but again, those results that you are absolutely right are nothing to do with values, and this is a discussion based on values that we believe that it can be the differentiator between Europe and the other blocks.
Can I just briefly react?
I was intending to open the floor for Q&A, but go on. Okay,
no, I
very
agree with the
briefly,
fact that
please.
we should have a discussion when it comes to our values as Europeans. It should be part of the discussion. My point was more, we shouldn't get it sidetrack us from really investing and closing the gaps which you identify in investment, talent, etc. So I think this would be one way to respond. But happy to continue the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. Following all these interesting presentations, I would like to open the floor for Q&A. Please, if you have any questions, raise your hand, state your name, surname, and maybe professional affiliation. So the floor is yours. Matthias, maybe you could encourage our audience.
Well, I would otherwise like to start, because we're talking about how that the EU needs to attract and retain talented individuals in order to develop prosperous companies, because we do not have European tech companies like the US or like China. We don't have them. And what kind of policy could be implemented, let's say tomorrow or like soon, that would support this goal?
This question is specific to someone, or it is to the panel?
Whoever feels more comfortable with answering it.
Andrew, please.
I think the base point of it is to have governments who are actually willing to open their doors for these companies, but also have the know-how within them to actually accommodate these companies to grow. And what I mean by that is that most often our politicians come from maybe a bit more of a traditional background, and the traditional background of an industry is somehow different in terms of their needs when they're a startup to a tech company. So we need our governments to be tech savvy in terms of like the flexibility they give to these companies, the workforce that we give them, the type of investments that we give them. This has been our experience back home in Malta as well, where we've managed to attract quite a number, in our scale of course, of tech companies, where it was mainly because we said we're open for a business, but it wasn't just we're open for a business. We said we're open for a business, we spoke with industry leaders across Europe, across the world, and saw what they really needed to do, we needed to do in order to attract them to come to Malta. And I think we should do this at a global level as well, we shouldn't shy away from going to companies even which are outside of Europe now and say, listen, what is it that is impeding you from of coming here to stop your business. And once I think we do that and we understand what's going on and react to that, I think that we will be much more open in this regard. And that's it.
Eline,
I just
please.
can add something that regulation, I think it's Maaike who mentioned, is often behind technologies because of the speed at which they develop. So I think good regulations should be those that are maybe flexible enough or agile enough to be able to adjust to changing technologies. And again, maybe AI will not be the thing in 10 years, and it's true we're giving it a lot of credit. And when it comes to, again, to get back to the ethical discussion, if it's about setting more requirements on top of those that already exist, say legally binding ethical requirements, I think that would be potentially, that would not make things easier for many companies to develop European AI. Maybe one example that is interesting to mention, because we talked about European AI strategies earlier, and some of them are coming with creative ideas. For instance, Lithuania, but also others are suggesting to implement visa startups that would allow to accelerate the process for those companies that want to settle in one country or another. And another usual recommendation is the regulatory sandboxes, which means that you can test your innovations being protected. That means you can test innovations that you wouldn't want to put in the market just yet, but you're not going to be sanctioned for actually experimenting with it.
Please.
I would make a distinction between, in your question, between create talent and retain talent. Because from a Portuguese perspective, we are a country where we are creating, but we are not able to retain it. Especially because the salaries, it's really very difficult to retain the very good people there, and they are moving out. I would make that kind of distinction. And the first part, creating talent, is about discussing our educational systems in each member state and at a European level. I think that we are moving forward in the right direction. For example, once again, the Digital Euro program, one of the pillars, it's exactly about advanced digital skills, which is because Europe is putting a lot of money in basic skills, but now it's time to go and to look exactly to what is needed for AI, what is needed for machine learning, what is needed for robotics, and this is we have a gap as Europe. The part of creating, retaining, for example, this is a good idea for a second or third discussion for Vocal Europe. We have, for example, digital taxation. We have very different countries that are able to attract the good companies, the big companies, based on very aggressive fiscal systems, tax systems. And unless we are able to get it, to have a common fiscal system looking to the digital opportunities, otherwise it will be very difficult to retain, because if we don't have the companies, how to retain the talent down there, I think it's a very complex, I would say it's probably the most difficult issue to deal when we speak about digital, and especially when we speak about AI.
I think a lot's been said, but I would also like to add, government can provide a lot more clarity about what they want, what they find acceptable and not. I know the German Industry Association has come out with a call, please, to the German government, please make up your mind about autonomous weapons, give us some clarity about where you stand, because then we know what can we develop, what can we not develop, which direction can we go in or not. And this, governments are still figuring out for themselves what they want or not, but if they can provide more clarity for their companies, that would also help for them knowing which directions they can pump in all their money, because if down the road at one point it gets banned, that's a huge loss of resources for them.
Thank you. Any question from the audience? Please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Veronika Kalitsova and I come from the Czech Parliament. I would like to have a question, especially to my diplomatic colleagues sitting on the panel. A very easy one, I would say, but maybe answer might not be. Do you think that diplomat is actually one of the professions that might disappear in the future, or at least if the number of the diplomats might decrease in the future because of AI, and why? Thank you.
I don't think so.
But sorry, this question is not only limited to diplomats, right, on the panel. So all right. Thanks.
No, Veronica tried to provocate us, but she's always very kind and very nice. I don't think so, because as we've already mentioned, especially in Andrew, we take a lot of time gathering data during our days, but the most important thing is exactly what we get from that data, what we can extract from the information that we gather. Especially looking forward, not just describing what we've heard, what we saw, but especially putting a part of us on the analysis that we do, and it is always a very critical one, about what we've heard and about what we saw. And this is, I think, the heart of the diplomacy. And machines won't do it. As far as I can try to realize what a machine can do. It means they can help us, it's already helping us, the technology, to get the data, but not the critical analysis. I think that for sure diplomacy or diplomats won't be in risk of other jobs, for sure, not diplomats. That's my feeling.
I think it will evolve. So, in a way, some parts of the job, yes, will disappear. So, if you're maybe a diplomat who's dealing more with, for example, the consular services part, that's something which I think may very well easily go into being automated. So that might disappear. It's a bit like almost like the travel agent of yesterday, that is slowly disappearing. But I can see the need, for example, of having data analysts as diplomats as well. It's something that we don't have right now, but with all the information that's going to come in, we'll probably need. So I think the job will evolve. The diplomats will change accordingly as well. Maybe we'll need less as well, because you have someone who can, in terms of efficiency, but I think it's part of also the ethical values we spoke about always, the human centricity of AI. The diplomat has to be there to take the final decision, make the final call.
Eline, would you like to react to that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it will be maybe an assisted type of diplomacy by AI tools. But indeed, I think for me that would leave more time for human-centric diplomacy, and diplomats could focus on high politics. Let's take, for example, the job of accountants. Before automation or digitalization of processes, it was a whole lot of paperwork going through data, and the profession has become a little bit more strategic. And I see the same evolution for your work. So I think some reports would say that AI can really allow for less human error and less passion and less ego in the process, which could be a cause of escalation in negotiations. But I really believe that the human factor will stay very important in your profession. And overall, I think we tend to, again, give too much credit to technology as a job destructor. I like to refer to the creative destruction notion, that you have those waves of industrial revolutions that replace some jobs because of automation. But think of John Maynard Keynes. He's an economist. He wrote this book in 1936, and he said, because of technology, we're gonna end up working 14 or 13 hours a week. That hasn't really happened. Unfortunately, we're still very, very useful, 40 hours a week at least. So I really want to just throw a more optimistic picture of the future.
Maaike, would you like to react?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that AI doesn't have semantic understanding. It might say sure a dog corresponds with a chien, but it doesn't know what a dog is. It doesn't understand what that creature is that correlates with those words. So it might work with text, but it doesn't necessarily understand what do those people who have written it feel. What are their priorities? Because diplomatic text, it's not about just what's at face value there, but about small words or small things in what's said or not said can be very significant here. And that type of understanding, that deep level understanding, is not something that an AI is capable of in the near future. So I think you can keep your job for a little bit longer.
Can I just quickly add? You mentioned something earlier, Maaike, that I really liked, which was that we need more diplomacy actually, because we need to maintain those diplomatic relations with countries like China and Russia actually. And that's very, very true, because with those trade wars and what we saw with Huawei, that sort of pushes countries like China to accelerate their innovation and to be even better and more independent at what they do. And do we want that? I believe not.
Any question from the panel? Please.
Hello, thank you very much for today's discussion. My name is Jeff Summer from the International Community. I wanted to ask, when I sum up a bit of the conversation until now, I think AI will not be the end of diplomacy, but I'm asking myself, how can it be actually the beginning of a new form of diplomacy? And so far there is no global institution or international institution that overviews actually the development of AI. And I'm asking myself actually how diplomacy can be a door opener to think jointly about an institution maybe on an international level that helps to think about AI and how it can be governed and overviewed.
Andrew, would you like to react to that?
I mean, as Ricardo said, in a way, like, this discourse around AI really started 2-3 years ago, so I think it's still in its infancy. And I agree with it, an ideal where you would have a international, so to speak, standards which are agreed upon by everyone, and everyone agrees to them in a way similar to what we have with the law of the sea, so to speak, something which was, I believe, entrenched in the UN Convention in the 1940s, 1950s, so it's fairly recent as well, even later. So it's something like that. I could see it happen. I know there are calls for this. If I recall, France have put forward some calls for having some sort of IPCC-like convention on AI, but it's still early stages. However, this is maybe the role where we talk about, as EU, what we can do moving forward is we can take the lead. So if as EU we set the parameters for this kind of international standards for AI, then it would be easier to go forward and have something established at the international level. So I think that should be the ultimate goal, that what you mentioned, but it shouldn't stop us from starting already.
Ricardo, would you like to, maybe Maaike?
No, please, you go ahead.
You can start.
I think the challenge is that AI is so broad that one like overarching conventional institution wouldn't really cover it all. I mean, the opportunities and challenges of AI in healthcare is not the same as in environment or in military. And I think that if you have one overarching institution or one overarching convention that becomes so general that it is no longer truly meaningful. I mean, at current level, AI is discussed in lots of different fora at the UN, which is also obviously problematic. It's so fragmented. A lot of duplication of efforts, discussion being held over and over again, which is also obviously not the great solution. But it is such a general fundamental technology that I think it would be difficult to have one overarching type of regulation at the international level.
Probably because it's so complex to have that kind of common ground, global common ground, probably, as it has been already, it's been already mentioned. You could have, and it is already happening, discussions on AI in different forums. For example, WIPO discussing AI and copyright, AI and intellectual property, where it enhance the creativity and where AI can protect also the content. On WTO, when we speak about trade, you've mentioned an example of a very practical project, but the discussion itself on a broader way, it can be for sure, it can take place for sure. It means that the Sustainable Development Goals, United Nations, probably you're gonna have some vertical discussions in different kind of multilateral forums, than just one big conference, one big treaty on AI. I don't believe that it's gonna be easy to get. You know, it's very complicated. Let's look to the climate. I think that we are not able to achieve a global agreement on that one. AI, it will be probably more difficult than that discussion.
Eline, would you like to?
Yeah, I agree with everything's been said.
All right. Is there any other question from the panel? Please, and then Sasha, please.
Raluca Cenatoni from Carnegie Europe. I would have a question related to ethics because it was highly discussed during this panel. From my point of view, more of a, let's say, academic researcher, I think that ethics is highly political and highly context specific, and is based on moral judgments about what is bad and what is good and so on, and is also a reflection of a certain worldview. And in this way, an ethical AI coming from the European Union, how does that play within the broader international context where you see different actors with their different moral views and different perspectives, and how to ensure the buy-in of these actors into the cyber norms and AI norms that we want to set as standards and guidelines. That is one question. And here, of course, I refer back to issues about engaging China and so on. And the second question, I heard a lot the word flexibility or flexible regulation, tailor-made specific policy approaches to specific domains where AI is applied and so on. And how would you practically see these policies working, or how do you envision this flexible regulation when it comes to AI products in specific domains?
Very comprehensive question. Please.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'm going to try to answer the first one by saying that you can't really assert cultural change or value systems. And that's not news. I think we see it with even back from religious wars across Europe, or it's a discussion that happens at that level that it's very difficult to find a common ground. So the best that we can do is to stay ourselves and stay true to what defines us, and try to keep the discussion with as many stakeholders as possible in as many countries as possible to avoid isolating anyone from that conversation. Another thing is when it comes to the this value discussion, I think rather than judging the technology and judging it's the ethics of the technology, it's about really discussing who is behind the decisions. For example, the Volkswagen diesel scandal, that's a corporate culture that truly led to the cheating of customers, and that this is what should be judged and should be assessed as unethical and unfair. I hope that answers your first question. And the second question is in practice. So how regulation can really be flexible in practice. I took the example of regulatory sandboxing. I think it's not just a buzzword. Trying to allow companies to experiment, for instance, facial recognition. Let's talk about that. I think this technology can be extremely valuable, but we don't exactly know whether it works well. There are many things that suggest that it doesn't quite work well. So we don't want to. I can understand policymakers may not want to see it implemented everywhere, but we have to make it better to be able to harness its benefits. And in order to do that, you have to test it. You have to feed it with more data. So you can do that in a protected environment potentially. So I think this is one of the ways in which, I had another idea, but then lost my train of thought. So maybe someone else can.
Andrew, you wanna?
Yeah, I think on the issue of ethics and values, I think we have to. That is the underlying scope part of everything that we do in a way. So all our laws, not just on AI, but on everything else that we do at European level, are based on as well on the Chart of Human Rights and so forth. Those are our values, our set of values. So the values are there, and we shouldn't shy away from saying, listen, these are our values, and we want to push them forward. Of course, we have to respect that even within Europe itself, not everyone maybe has 100% the same value. So that's something you have to keep in mind, let alone when talking about third countries. And also as well, you have to keep in mind that values evolve with time. So this is not a process we can say, you know, we go next year in a council, European Council, okay, these are European values for AI and that's it, we entrench them and we forget about them. These are things that I think with time and experience change as well. But we should not shy away from saying this is who we are, these are our values, and we should work on those things. In terms of the flexibility part of it, of the regulation, I think a bit on the strand of what Eline was saying as well, the flexibility of being able to let businesses explore and start to explore in terms of like what they can do within the limits of course legality. For example, one of the things last week we had a summit in Malta on AI summit for businesses. We had over 10,000 people up there. One of the issues that we realized is that most businesses who want to open in Europe and want to develop is that they don't find places to actually implement their ideas. So in terms of like, you know, we should be much more open. For example, if there's a startup comes to a city saying, you know, I want to do this idea, I say, okay, let's use this city as a test bed for this idea. That's kind of like flexibility we're talking about in terms of like saying, giving small derogation in this regard and moving forward. And I think the important thing is that one thing that's coming from the smallest country in Europe, we tend to criticize a lot in terms of regulatory approach in general, is that this one-size-fits-all approach sometimes to legislation. And this is particularly important, I believe, in disruptive technologies which move so fast like AI. We can't just say, you know, it's A, B, C, and that's it. We have to be able to say, you know, we have to adapt. So that's why we believe that having the values at the core of everything else and then being able to adapt is the best way forward.
Ricardo?
I will just make a comment on the first question. For sure you have had the chance to read the document that has been issued last April on the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. Despite the cultural differences between an American and a Chinese and we Europeans, to be very honest, I think that we all, American, Europeans and Chinese, we all for sure agree on that, on the basics of that document, on the principles that are stated on that document. And I remind that 3 or 4 months ago, I've attended a meeting where the chief legal officer, Brad Smith, the Microsoft chief legal officer, he welcomed that document, the ethical guidelines, and more. He stated that he would like to have, and Microsoft has done a strong job on that, at the Washington state level in the States, more or less the kind of principles exactly for the facial recognition. It means that we have an American company, which is a global one, but it's of course American centric, claiming about exactly the need also in the States of that kind of principles, which is very interesting. To say that despite the cultural differences, we should not be shy to move on with our cultural and ethical approach. The regulation will come afterwards. That's why we are for sure all very, very curious about what and how, especially how Madame Vestager will try to implement it during the upcoming 100 days.
Yeah, really good questions to look at. Very annoying ones as well to answer. I mean, you're super right that ethics is super political and a reflection of the worldviews. I mean, key here, of course, within Europe is that our discussions on ethics should be diverse. We should represent all different types of people, not just of countries, all different types of minorities, of race, gender, sexuality. I like in the ethics commission that people with disabilities are explicitly represented, which are often excluded as a specific stakeholder with specific needs on the AI discussions. But also, I mean, outside the EU, the issue is, you know, we need truly global representation if we want develop global norms, and it also includes people outside US, China, and Europe. people from the global south, all these other hubs, super interested in AI, looking at Singapore, looking at India, UAE, lots of countries like really interested in AI, and they need to be part of the discussions. And if we have all our discussions, in Geneva and in New York, the most expensive cities in the world, that is not helping at all to make this, really global discussions. Your second question is very interesting. You're familiar with my answer, I guess, but within the discussion on autonomous weapon systems, the discussions have gone back at least, for quite a few years. And for starters, I think a lot of discussions are focused on what type of weapons do we find problematic. What are there specific subcategory of weapons that have a certain level of automation in their targeting? Who selects, who engages with targets, and can we demarcate these type of weapons? Instead, now the focus is shifting a bit more on what type of human-machine relation do we want? How do we want the machine to have control over specific functions? So instead of focusing on a specific type of technology, we look at how the technology and the machine relates, which would be a bit more regulation-proof. But it's difficult for sure.
Sasha, you had a question, right?
I'm Sasha Kulanovic from Local Europe. I would like to touch upon the use of AI in political and strategic communication. You mentioned deepfakes, which can be used, of course, in disruptive information operations in political communication. And then we also mentioned verification tools. So what are the verification tools that can be used to prevent this disruptive use of AI in political and strategic communication? And of course the question applies to the whole panel.
Would you like to go for it?
Yeah, it's very practical. If I understand correctly, you're asking whether there are any tools that can prevent from some risks, for instance, related to disinformation, or
for the use of AI in disruptive information campaigns, such as, for example, deepfakes.
Yeah. Right. So that's interesting. As an example, deepfakes uses that technology called GANs, G-A-Ns. I'm not exactly sure which word goes with which letter of the acronym, sorry, but it is a technology. And that technology is highly beneficial in medicine, especially and for the healthcare system. So that's just a side note to mention that some technologies, even though they produce things that may be a problem on the web, like deepfakes, they can also be highly beneficial. So I think that's one way to answer your question. AI can help to combat disinformation, but it's not a silver bullet. We've hosted an event actually on AI and disinformation in February here in the context of elections. You can definitely tell that it has potential to analyze patterns, identify problems, remove content faster than any human being could. But we should not expect that all the solutions will come from that technology. So I think, for instance, when, let me take an example. AI, like filters, the way they work, they're not perfect yet. And sometimes when you're programming for a filter to remove certain type of content, that you can imagine may be illegal or harmful, the filter may not be 100% perfect and might remove content that is actually perfectly legal. And there's a proposal that came out recently, it's called the Online Terrorist Content proposal, that's going to be in the trilogues very soon, and there's this removal deadline that's an hour to remove content after notifying a company. And that means companies, because they're afraid of facing sanctions, they might use those filters a little bit too much and a little bit too quickly when that technology can help, but it's just not to that level of perfection yet. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
You can say if it doesn't.
No, I mean,
Is there anyone who would like to react to that, the question? Or otherwise we have another question at the back.
Yeah, Gregor Kupar with Info Asset. I have a question. Isn't this here really a question of innovation and timing? Because when we look at technological innovation, usually first comes innovation, then comes the legislation. Because legislation doesn't know what's possible until the innovation actually is there and develops. I'm wondering whether with AI, we're not looking at legislation a bit too early without really knowing what everything is possible with AI to then make a choice, okay, this is how far we want to go on medical, this is how far we're going to go on military, this is how far we want to go on help for disabled people. Aren't we talking legislation too early?
Ricardo, you want to start?
Yes, and so sorry, I don't agree with you. I don't think that it's too early.
Question.
Okay, okay, then it's easy. Regarding your question, I say my answer is no. It means that AI is everywhere. He's here in plenty of apps. It's within the software of the cell phone itself. It means that and legislation will come always after the innovation. I really don't know one example where legislation come before innovation. If you could give me one, because I don't remember one.
That's what I'm saying, there isn't. But
No,
aren't we trying to regulate now before we even fully understand the potential of AI?
But the potential of AI, probably, but we know already some risks of AI. We know the way that AI is already using, not in the good way. Of course, there are a lot of good examples, but there are some bad examples. The question is that timing now is very important, as you've said. I don't have that kind of perspective that it will burden the process of innovation. In this case, I think that we must regulate, and we are already going far behind the innovation process. Well, just to your question.
Just to react.
Maybe Maaike can pick up, and then I'll turn the floor to you.
I'm also on team no. I mean, it's a classic dilemma. Do you wait and then you have a better idea of what you're talking about, what the real possibilities are? Or, I mean, if you're early, you have a better chance of stopping potential harmful defects. If after it's already been developed, the knowledge is out there, it's much harder to control and to keep it within certain boundaries. I'll keep it short, so I'll just say, the ban on blinding laser weapons was a preventive regulation before the technology was developed. It banned blinding laser weapons against pilot eyes, which was a harmful technology. And there was research, and the UN international community decided, no, we don't want this, and they banned it. So there definitely, I can mention more historical examples, but it definitely does happen for sure.
Andrew?
I think this time around because we're always criticized of doing things too late. So this time we're trying to, I think as Europe, trying to maybe catch the boat in this regard. And I think we have a very concrete example of where we had a nascent technology, which is social media, which we not regulate, and now we're trying to regulate after the mess has been done. So I think we're trying to prevent, in a way, the same thing to happen. But I think this time around, the approach that's been taken is a bit better in terms of we're not trying to regulate. I feel right now, I don't feel that there's like this talk of having a heavy regulation on everything. We're mainly talking about ethical values at this point in time. So I think having ethical values set gives you the chance to adapt moving forward. Because AI, by its nature, is so complex and so evolving that in 5 years' time, if we decide not to do anything now, in 5 years' time, say, let's regulate, there's going to be someone say, oh, it's just 5 years, you know, it's still evolving, let's wait another 5 years, and then another 5 years, same thing. So we'll end up never regulating the thing whilst having all these different issues popping up. So I think if we set from the beginning, these are our values, and then we can have sort of this rapid response to issues that crop up. I think it's better than trying to put the genie back in the bottle like we're trying to do now with disinformation, social media.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Nico. So two things. I think we tend to focus too much on policies that aim to prevent the risks rather than encouraging innovation and seeing things as an opportunity. Second, actually maybe I have three things to mention. Depends what kind of regulation. So I think yes, but maybe we should look into innovative types of policy making and regulations, such as codes of conduct or sector-specific industry standards, things like that, that could work. I know that's a challenged argument, but maybe that's a good way to keep a regulation agile, or to keep things flexible. And another point I'd like to mention is, well, the GDPR was drafted when we were talking about big data, and it impacts automated profiling and decision making, but we were not talking about AI at that time. And now we're realizing, well, it does actually have an impact on it. So sometimes it's true that we may be moving forward too quickly. But yeah, I'm not on the team, yes. I'm more, yeah, I guess it's a more nuanced response I'd like to bring.
Thank you so much. If there is no any other question from the audience, I would like to conclude our today's panel and discussion. So I thank you all very much for joining us. We would like to welcome you at our next and future panels and discussions. So thank you so much also for being with us. Thank you.